Good afternoon. On behalf of the Center for Community Progress, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. My name is Julia Zimmerman, and I serve as the Program Officer for Education, Leadership, and Engagement here at Community Progress. I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C., and I encourage you to share your name and where you're signing in from in the chat. Community Progress webinars equip participants with the building blocks to understand and solve tough challenges related to property vacancy, abandonment, and deterioration. For today's webinar, we're joined by Nora Daly, an Associate Director of Technical Assistance at the Center for Community Progress, Christina Carter-Grant, the Associate Director of the National Land Bank Network at the Center for Community Progress, and Kaylin Bruno, the Director of Environmental Services at the New Jersey Institute of Technology Center for Community Systems. Before turning it over to our speakers, I want to mention that we will allow time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. If you have a question during the presentation, please submit them via the Q&A box below. We will share presentation slides and a video recording of today's presentation in the week following. If you experience any technical difficulties, please send an email to Julia Zimmerman at jzimmerman@communityprogress.org. And with that, I will turn it over to Nora.
Thank you, Julia. Just going to share my slides quickly. All right. Great to see you all this afternoon. As Julia said, my name is Nora Daly. I'm an Associate Director with the Technical Assistance Team at the Center for Community Progress. We are the only national nonprofit dedicated to addressing vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties at the systems level. And we do this work in a variety of ways, including educating stakeholders through trainings, conferences, and webinars, like this one this afternoon, researching and advocating for practice changes, and providing direct technical assistance to communities. Over the last few years, we've been receiving a grant from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to explore how communities across the U.S. are leveraging land banks and land banking approaches to revitalize brownfield properties. Today, I'm going to share some high-level takeaways from this work with you all before I turn it over to my colleague, Christina Carter-Grant, who's going to share some more specific examples from land banks across the country. Before diving into what we've learned about land banks and brownfield revitalization, I want to take a step back and talk about what is considered a brownfield property. So this is the definition used by the EPA. A brownfield property is where real or perceived presence of contamination poses a barrier to redevelopment, making it more difficult, risky, and expensive to revitalize the property. There's a number of reasons that it's important for communities to address brownfield properties. First and foremost, having a contaminated property in your community poses a risk to public health and safety. It can also contribute to entrenched vacancy because these properties are difficult to redevelop, so they tend to sit unused for a number of years. I also want to share some examples of what a brownfield property can look like. I think when most folks hear the word brownfield, they think about a former factory or an industrial facility like what's pictured on this slide. However, brownfields can also be former businesses where toxins were used, so a gas station, a dry cleaner, a former oil change facility, where it's more difficult to reuse the property for another commercial purpose because of toxins that were previously used at the site. And even older residential properties can be considered brownfields if they were built in the past and toxic building materials were used, such as lead paint or asbestos. And I share these examples just to give you a sense of how common brownfield properties are and how they really do affect many diverse communities across the US. So it's not just an issue in communities that have legacies of industrial and manufacturing uses. So similarly, I want to share, before we dive into too much detail, how Community Progress defines the term land bank. Since joining Community Progress, I've noticed that there's lots of different definitions that folks use in the field, and it can lead to some confusion. So to clarify, when we talk about land banks, we are typically using that word as a noun, not a verb, to describe a public agency or program typically created pursuant to state enabling legislation that gives the agency unique powers to return vacant, abandoned, deteriorated, and tax delinquent properties back to productive use. So, in brief, what distinguishes a land bank in Community Progress's perspective is that it's created by that state enabling legislation, and it does have that explicit focus on vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties. Although land banking powers can vary quite a bit from state to state, depending on what's in the legislation that created the land bank, there are some specific powers that are common to all the most effective land banks, and those include the ability to acquire tax foreclosed properties cost effectively, the ability to hold properties tax-free, the ability to extinguish liens and clear title, and the ability to flexibly dispose of properties in alignment with community goals. So these are what is going to set a land bank apart from other public entities that may deal with land, such as a redevelopment authority or housing authority. So if you're wondering whether your community has a land bank or whether your state has land bank enabling legislation, we do have an interactive map on our website, which you can access through the resource tab, and you can go and look up your community or any other community you're interested in to see if there's a land bank operating there and if there's enabling legislation in your state. So we did find through our research that many communities are using land banks as a tool to address stuck brownfield properties and return these properties to productive use in alignment with community goals. Some of the ways that land banks are uniquely suited to addressing brownfield properties include their ability to acquire properties cost effectively, and I would add here as well to hold properties cost free. So as I mentioned previously, part of what defines a brownfield property is that it takes a long time to redevelop and it's expensive to redevelop. So acquiring the property at low or no cost and holding the property tax-free can really help to keep costs down during a lengthy redevelopment process. By design, land banks have expertise in vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties, which most brownfield properties are. And land banks are typically governed by appointed boards, which insulates them from political turnover at the local level. So this is really important because brownfield properties can take years or even decades to redevelop. So having that steady leadership and vision for the property throughout the redevelopment process is really useful. Brownfields exist in communities with industrial and manufacturing legacies. I said earlier, these are not the only communities with brownfields, but they do tend to have higher concentrations of brownfield properties. So that's valuable as well. As nonprofit, governmental, or quasi-governmental entities, which most land banks are, they are eligible for federal grant funding from the EPA to address brownfield properties. And finally, similarly, because of their organizational structure, many land banks qualify for certain environmental liability protections at both the federal and the state level. I want to talk a little bit more about environmental liability, but I do want to present this slide with the caveat that I am not a lawyer. However, some of my colleagues at the Center for Community Progress are lawyers. They did this research, and what we found is that although under federal law, holders of contaminated properties can be liable for costs and damages, federal protections for state and local governments that apply when the state or local government acquires the property specifically for the purpose of redevelopment. So they want to remediate the contamination and return the property to a safe and productive use. Those protections can also apply to land banks if the land bank acquires the property via the tax foreclosure process. Additionally, even if a land bank acquires a property through another process, such as donation or a purchase on the open market, they can take certain steps to qualify for federal liability protections, such as conducting all appropriate inquiries before acquiring a brownfield property. Additionally, in our legal research, we found that there are at least 6 states which include state law protections from environmental liability for land banks. And in addition, some land banks have taken unique approaches, such as in New York State, where there's multiple land banks that have entered into a covenant not to sue with the State Department of Environmental Quality to ensure protection from state environmental liability when they engage in brownfields work. So I just want to highlight that as another approach. If there's not an explicit protection in state law, there are still ways to approach state liability protection. I want to talk just a little bit about funding, and then Kaylin will be sharing a lot more detail later on in the webinar. So EPA grant funding, as I mentioned previously, is a resource that is available to land banks. In addition to this federal funding, many state and local governments offer grants or loans to support communities in addressing brownfield properties. Land banks have also used their own internal funding to support land bank brownfield revitalization, and this includes funding that they receive from local governments, revenue generated from property sales, and tax recapture from properties that were previously returned to productive use. Lastly, in-kind contributions are a really important resource for land banks to consider leveraging if they're looking into doing brownfield revitalization. This could include staff time from local government or nonprofit partners, environmental consultants, and academic institutions. So this is another resource to consider what's available in your community when looking to engage in brownfields revitalization. Lastly, I want to share an opportunity that we currently have available with you all. So we are accepting applications for a technical assistance scholarship focused on communities that want to leverage land banks and land banking approaches to brownfield revitalization. We will be awarding up to 5 scholarships, in-kind work of up to 200 hours of technical assistance services per community at no cost to the community, and the focus will be engaging land banks in brownfield redevelopment. So there's a number of specific project types we're looking to support. These include in states without enabling legislation, helping to craft land bank enabling legislation, for communities that have the legislation but don't have a land bank, helping to set up a land bank to address brownfield properties. And lastly, for land banks that have not engaged in brownfields work in the past, or maybe they have, but they're looking to refine their approach, that's another project type we can support as well. We are currently accepting applications. You can scan the QR code on this slide to learn more about the scholarship and apply. The application closes September 19th. And lastly, I do want to share priority will be given to current EPA grant recipients. However, we will also consider former recipients and communities that applied but were not awarded funding on a case-by-case basis. In addition to EPA grant funding, if you are receiving targeted brownfield assessment support from your local EPA regional office, that is also a factor that we will consider in the eligibility criteria. So I'm happy to answer questions about the scholarship either through the Q&A feature or during the question and answer portion of the webinar. But for now, I will just say thank you so much for your time. And if you do want to learn more and do a little bit of a deeper dive on some of the information that I've covered at just a very high level today, I strongly encourage you to check out our Land Banks and Brownfields Online Resource Center, which again, you can access through the Resources tab. We have created a variety of materials on this topic, everything from short explainer videos to primers and in-depth reports exploring different ways land banks have or can engage in brownfield revitalization. Some of the resources are pictured here. You can access them all on our website. But first, you can hear firsthand from my colleague, Christina Carter-Grant, Associate Director of the National Land Bank Network. Christina was the lead author on our case studies publication, which is pictured here. And she is going to share more about the individual work that land banks across the country are doing to address brownfields in their communities. Thank you all again.
Thank you so much, Nora, and thank you all again for joining us today on this webinar. You know, this was a really great project to be a part of, and I'm very excited to share with you the amazing work of these land banks. So as Nora mentioned earlier, with support from an EPA grant, we had the opportunity to interview and conduct site visits with 3 land banks that we identified as leaders in the brownfield redevelopment space. That is Genesee County Land Bank, Houston Land Bank, and the West Virginia Land Stewardship Corporation. And from our research and learning a little bit more about their stories and the stories behind their work in particular, we noticed a key theme emerge for each land bank. For the Genesee County Land Bank, we looked at them as epitomizing persistence. For the Houston Land Bank, we felt they best represented being a people-powered land bank. And lastly, for the West Virginia Land Stewardship Corporation, we felt that they epitomized partnerships and how to leverage partnerships. We unpack these themes a little bit more in the Land Banks and Brownfields publication, but for the sake of today's webinar, I'd like to walk you through a few examples highlighted in the book. We'll first get started with Genesee County Land Bank, which is located in Flint, Michigan, a city about an hour outside of Detroit. Now, some background context for those not familiar with Flint's story. Flint is a city that once upon a time used to have a booming auto industry. But as that industry declined and there was population loss, the city saw a rise in vacancy, abandonment, and deterioration, or what we refer to as VAD. So the Genesee County Land Bank, or as I'll occasionally refer to as GCLBA, has been instrumental in tackling that vacancy and abandonment in the city. It is one of the larger land banks with about 31 full-time staffers, and they have over 14,000 properties in their inventory, many of which are brownfields. GCLBA has a data-driven approach to when it comes to dealing with their brownfield properties, meaning they use data to focus on sites with strong market potential. However, and just as importantly, they prioritize projects that don't just make financial sense, but they also serve the public good. One particular brownfield property was an oil change facility that also operated as a car wash and an auto repair shop. So in general, the site was contaminated with petroleum products. GCLBA was able to acquire the facility in 2011 through the tax foreclosure process. They first started remediation through an EPA emergency response to the oil drums that were on site, before then moving to complete phase 1 and 2 assessments with support from an EPA assessment grant. They also leveraged funds from Michigan's Blight Elimination Program for demolition and cleanup, and the site was development ready by 2015. Now, what I love about what the Genesee County Land Bank did is they did not sell the property to the highest bidder. They actually held on to it for 8 years in hopes of it being used for a project that benefited the greater good. And this turned out to be a good decision because in 2019, the Greater Flint Mental Health Facilities and the Genesee Health System acquired the site for what would become the Center for Children's Integrated Services. And as you can now see from the photo that's on the screen, it is a beautiful 60,000 square foot state-of-the-art facility that offers both mental and physical health services for kids in Flint, but also for children in the surrounding communities as well. And what's really special about this project is that providers that used to be spread out around the city, they're now all brought together under one roof, and this building is located next to a major highway, making it much more convenient and accessible for families to access care. So for me, I always like to say that this project is the perfect intersection between brownfield redevelopment and addressing overall public health needs. Our next land bank is the land bank we dubbed the people-powered land bank because they epitomize this in the work that they do, and that is the Houston Land Bank. So as you can see, they have about 8 full-time staffers, over 400 properties in their inventory, 100% of which are vacant lots. And on screen is a picture from their Juice and Justice breakfast, where they bring together community stakeholders to discuss solutions for environmental justice in the Houston area. They even offer resources like Hidden Gems, which is a online crowdsourcing tool where residents are actually able to go in and submit information as well as photos on potential brownfield sites. So when we say people powered, we mean that people are the very core of their work. So our next case study takes us over into Houston's North Side, where a defunct 6-acre yellow cab headquarters sat vacant and contaminated by petroleum, underground storage tanks, and previous machinery use. In 2019, the Houston Land Bank purchased the site from the city and worked with the EPA and other partners to address the contamination on the site. So they completed soil testing, they removed the underground tanks, they did some groundwater monitoring. It was a process that took them about 4 years. Harris County would come into the project and express interest a little bit later on in 2021, and they actually purchased tracts of land on the site for $7.3 million. And together with the Houston Land Bank, they aligned on a shared redevelopment vision. But they didn't form this vision on their own. Instead, even before acquisition, The Houston Land Bank engaged the community through a resident-led visioning session where the land bank learned that the residents desired to see on the new site things like affordable housing, diverse grocery options, a community hub, entertainment options, walkable green space. So the Houston Land Bank and Harris County used the community's input, and now the plan is to move forward with developing 40 affordable single family homes, which Houston Land Bank will take the lead on. And on the multifamily development side of things, Harris County will work to create over 100 multifamily units. And I am happy to share that as of 2024, the site was officially redevelopment ready, and this image shows one of the many buildings that have since been demolished on the site. So what was once a blighted, contaminated property will soon become a hub for affordable housing, amenities, just overall creating a vibrant community life. And it happened because the land bank and its partners were willing to take on the risk, clear the barriers, and put residents at the center of redevelopment. Now, if you're a land bank on this call, you might be thinking, hey, this seems like a lot of time, a lot of capacity or resources that my land bank simply does not have. The great news is that not all brownfield projects are the same, or nor are they always time or capital intensive. Take, for instance, one of the many case studies featured in the publication that comes out of Syracuse, New York. The community came together and said, hey, we want this former gas station and auto repair shop to be a gas station again, but one that's safe and up to date and better serving our neighborhood. So the Greater Syracuse Land Bank got involved and they started with doing some environmental due diligence. They completed phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessments, and then they marketed the property for sale. Following, they were able to find a local buyer who was interested in helping making the community's vision a reality. And even though the site would still be used as a gas station, Greater Syracuse Land Bank, they took care of the tough part. They were able to remove the old corroded underground storage tanks, and they completed the official tank closure with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. That cleanup was an especially unnecessary step since it allowed the business owner to actually qualify for construction financing. So fast forward to today, the buyer has pulled permits and is finalizing construction financing and the property purchase. And on screen is what the future site will look like: a new gas station and a full service convenience store. And once the sale closes, the land bank will be able to recover their out-of-pocket costs, which was about $46,000. So this is a great example that brownfield redevelopment doesn't always have to be this multi-year, multi-million-dollar effort. With the right tools and partnerships, even small properties can be transformed into community assets. And as I close, I want to highlight 3 takeaways for land banks looking to engage in brownfield redevelopment work. And these are takeaways that came out of working on these case studies. Number 1, stay persistent in your brownfield remediation work. Unforeseen obstacles are bound to happen. Sometimes it's changes in funding. Other times it might be, oh my goodness, we found another underground storage tank on the site. Know that it's possible to overcome these obstacles. And if you ever feel stuck, there are resources to help. There are land banks that have already done the work and are willing to lend advice. And most importantly, Center for Community Progress and the National Land Bank Network, we're always here to be a support for you. Keep the end goal in mind, and that is doing something that would be the ultimate benefit, the ultimate good of your community. Number 2, develop a people-powered plan that engages residents in the change they want to see in their communities. Who are you bringing to the table? What resources are you providing to them to participate in the work? Or how are you involving them in your redevelopment plans? Residents should be prioritized, engaged, and also, most importantly, heard in your redevelopment work. This is something even more critical because while brownfields are located in all communities of all types and sizes, they disproportionately impact Black and Brown communities the most. So environmental justice that centers the residents should be your North Star in this work. And lastly, establish partnerships with community stakeholders who can help strategize, organize resources, and champion the work. It's one thing to lead this type of work alone, but there's power in partnerships. Partnerships opens the doors for things like aggregating funding resources or regularly collaborating on opportunities for redevelopment projects. You should assess the stakeholders in your community and connect with them on brownfield work if they align with your community goals. Before turning it over to Kaylin, who will share a little bit more about what types of resources are out there to support your current or future brownfield projects, I want to give a special thank you to the land banks that you see on screen and their corresponding case studies, whether it was sharing your work in an interview or giving us a front row seat with your brownfield work through a site visit. The publication would not be made possible without you. And though we did not get a chance to cover all of the case studies in today's presentation, you can learn more by downloading the Land Banks and Brownfields case studies resource. My Julia colleague will be or has already shared the resource in the Resource Center. And as I wrap up, I do want to end with a quote from Krista Stoneham, the Executive Director of the Houston Land Bank, that I believe best summarizes why this work is so important. And it reads, this is about more than development. It's about dismantling systems of injustice and creating a new standard for how cities grow. We're standing with communities to reclaim their land, their power, and their future. Together, we are creating a city where every resident has the opportunity to thrive, where no one is left behind, and where the legacy of neglect is transformed into one of empowerment. Thank you all for your time sharing Nora and I's contact information on screen. So please do not hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions about the scholarship opportunity or the case studies in general. We're always happy to help. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Kaylin.
All right, thank you, Christina. Gonna go ahead and share my screen. Thank you again to everyone who's joining us, spending your lunch hour, if you're on the East Coast, with us to learn more about the role of land banks in brownfield revitalization. So again, my name is Kaylin Bruno. I run the technical team here at NJIT, Technical Assistance to Brownfield Communities Program, or TAB for short. I will explain to you more about what our program is later in our presentation. So about me, I'm a professional geologist. I'm a licensed site remediation professional. So my expertise is more on the environmental cleanup aspect of the brownfield redevelopment process. So for my portion, I'd like to give you a little bit of insight into that process because I think it will help you understand and give you some perspective on how we get those like glorious before and after projects that Christina showed us. So how does this happen? We start our brownfield journey with planning and having a community-wide perspective. Sometimes in environmental work, it's very easy to lose the forest for the tree, but this is something I think land banks are really strong in this regard. Once you have your priority site to focus on, the first step is your site assessment. Here we're going to look into the history of the site to see if there's any reason to think that there might be some contamination on the site and where those areas are. The second step is your phase 2 environmental site assessment. This is where we're going out, we're collecting samples, and we are seeing if there is contamination or not. We compare the levels to some established standards and see if there's acceptable or some unacceptable levels of contaminants at that site. If we do confirm that unfortunately we do have contamination at the site, then we go out in our remedial investigation. This is where we collect many more samples, really trying to determine how deep does it go? How bad is it? How far does it go? And then we can make a plan to clean up the site and do some site remediation. And the reason why I think it's important to tell people about this process and how this works, give them a little bit of insight. Of course, this is just a very quick overview, is that the main thing to know is that this is a step-by-step investigation. And this is what can give us confidence to redevelop a formerly dirty site safely and reuse it for something like, housing, for instance. This method is like growing a plant though, right? You can't just plant the seed and walk away and hope for the best. There are things you need to do to nurture your project. So there are some activities that we do at the beginning and need to happen all throughout the process. So these are things like community engagement, having a vision, maybe having to revisit that vision, building and maintaining partnerships, finding funding and finding more funding. So, just to kind of reiterate what Nora was talking about in those 6 ways and the 6 powers that land banks have that make them really well suited for this work, I think in this general brownfields process, those nurturing type activities are other ways that land banks are just very strong and position them well to do brownfield work. Here's an example I just want to share with you. Wayne County Regional Land Bank in New York. This is just a screenshot from their website. They have a portfolio of brownfield sites that they are ushering through that process that I just showed you. The planning, assessment, cleanup. And here on their website, they have the different environmental milestones and the associated reports with them. So you can easily see how they're doing that with all these different sites. So how are they able to do that? And how are they affording this, I guess? Most importantly is that, one, they have strong partnerships, and 2, they're pretty savvy with getting EPA brownfield grants. They've created a framework for themselves that covers some of those planning activities, the assessment activities, with some of the corresponding EPA brownfield grants. So not only are they able to fund those different activities, but they're able to address their liabilities and making the sites more marketable to developers while, keeping them moving through that process. That's pretty key. So, how can you create a similar framework? So there's a few resources available. I'm going to cover them now. The big one, and probably just like most timely to talk about now, is the EPA MARC brownfields grants. The very important thing to know about this is that this cycle coming up for FY26, this is the last year that they're going to offer increased grant amounts through the bipartisan infrastructure law, or that act really was able to fund a lot more projects. This is the last year that we're anticipating that this funding is going to be available. And this is key because it's not only more money for the program, it can fund more projects, but there's other really great perks like not having cost matching. So again, this is going to be active for this next cycle coming up. Here's just an overview of the amounts and terms that we're anticipating. And this is from an EPA announcement themselves. So this is what they put out there. So this year, we're looking at multi-purpose assessment and cleanup grants being available. There is another bucket called RLF, or the Revolving Loan Fund. That's offered every other year. We're on an off year for that this year, but it's important to know, the example I gave with the Wayne County Land Bank, their county has a revolving loan fund, so they're able to leverage those funds for their program. But yeah, so the assessment grants, that covers planning, community outreach, phase 1s, phase 2s, remedial investigation, that work that I was telling you about where you're going out, you're sampling, everything up to cleanup. This grant covers those activities. The next is the cleanup grant. So That's everything after we investigate. That has a separate bucket because that can get pretty expensive. And they also offer multi-purpose, which is a combination of the two. So you can do some assessment work. You have to do cleanup at one site with the multi-purpose grant, and it can be all at the same site, or at least in the past they've preferred you kind of have more of a regional perspective on that. So you're doing maybe some planning, some assessment at a couple different sites, cleanup at least one. Something I want to highlight for you and draw attention to is because this planning aspect of the assessment grants. Here's like a menu of things. This is from the EPA website of activities that are available and covered under assessment grants. So that plant diagram that I showed you about the process, it's admittedly very simplified. Every site is going to have its own little like quirks and challenges, and things in the real world are just like a little more complicated, as you can imagine. And there's more things you're going to want to know about a site before you really dive into the development. So these are things like if the site has experienced like flooding in the past, maybe there's wetlands on the site that could present a land use challenge, a permitting challenge for reuse. Do you need infrastructure upgrades, or maybe you need a little extra help with the visioning? So doing a targeted marketing viability study. These are tools that are available through the assessment grants to help you in the process. Understanding that you're not a brownfield expert in all aspects, and in addition to the environmental contamination, there might be some other unknowns and question marks that you really want to address. So I just like to point this out. Not everyone's aware of that. So I also want to talk about eligibility for these grants. Land bank organizations are generally under one of these categories, like Nora had mentioned. So whether you're a general purpose unit of government, nonprofit, a quasi-governmental entity, you are eligible. The other thing to note about eligibility is your sites also have to be eligible as well. So you can't be the responsible party for one of those sites. That's one aspect of this. The other is that in order to perform assessment work, so remember, that's all that work up to cleanup, sampling, and your phase ones and stuff. You don't have to own the site. So that's something to keep in mind. But to go for a cleanup grant, you do have to own the site. There's more to that, but I think that's like just generally what you need to know about that. And now to the cycle, what does this look like? Any day, well, no, usually in September. So in the coming weeks, we're going to anticipate seeing the request for applications, the RFA. Those are the guidelines. That's going to tell us everything what the EPA is going to look for in your application. That's going to come out soon. Once they release that, the applications are due in 6 weeks. In the past, that's been like before Thanksgiving, so we're coming up on that time frame now. They review all the applications, and then we can expect an announcement of the winners in the spring. And then there are some administrative things. Then if you are successful, you need to get your work plan together, get your cooperative agreement. That all happens during the summer, and then your funding could be available to you late summer, early fall. So overall, it's 1 year from the time you're applying to potentially getting that funding. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so that's kind of the biggie. That's the EPA Brownfield competitive grants, but there's some other programs too that might be helpful for you. So under the umbrella of technical assistance. So there's 3 main aspects to this. It's land revitalization technical assistance, targeted brownfield assessment program, and technical assistance to brownfield communities program. I know that's a lot. I'm not going to quiz you on it. And they all kind of sound the same, but there are some important distinctions I want you to know. The first thing you need to know is what EPA region you are in. So there's 10 EPA regions. On the left are the EPA contacts for each region. The site that this is from is also linked in the resources in case you need to reference that. So the sorry about that. Yeah, I am in New Jersey. I'm in Region 2. I think I only saw one other New Jerseyan on the call now. I saw a lot of Michiganders and Ohioans, so a lot of Region 5 represented today. These technical assistance programs are available through your region. So this first, the land revitalization technical assistance, it's a program, it's not a grant. This is a non-competitive program and it's available as long as the funding is available through that region. And remember those planning activities I showed you, kind of the menu, those are covered under this program. It's non-competitive. You fill out a form, and the EPA will use their own contractor for this work. Just an example is from Louisville. They had their priority site identified, but there was kind of some complicating factors that needed to be looked into, like whether it was eligible for like a historic preservation. There was also some building codes that needed to be looked at. So through this program, they were able to get some renderings, which can be really helpful. They were able to do this historic resource evaluation and look at the rendering or the building codes. So the next quick one, targeted brownfield assessments. This is, again, a non-competitive program that the EPA will use their own contractor to perform phase 1 and phase 2 assessments, maybe some cleanup planning as well. So again, remember our process. This is under the site assessments portion. And so that's TBA. We have a lot of acronyms, just like in the land bank world, right? Not to be confused with TAB or TAB. Oh, sorry. And for your TBA coordinators at your regional EPA regional office, these are the ones who you would reach out to if you're interested in getting one of those free phase 1, phase 2 assessments. Again, this is linked in the resources tab, the technical assistance. I'll just leave that up for a second to note your regional coordinator here. Oh, there it is. Sorry, my animations are a little getting the best of me here. But okay, all that to say, I'm leaving the best for last, in my opinion. So we have technical assistance to brownfield communities. That's programs like mine, where we have an EPA grant to provide free technical assistance to communities, local governments, nonprofits, entities like land banks in their brownfields challenge. I know I just threw a lot of information at you, but I think the one thing to remember is note who your tab provider is, and they should really, I think, be your first call, because we're the experts. We know a lot of these resources that are available, and we can point you to the right people if you're embarking on your brownfields journey here. Again, I'll reiterate that assistance is free. NJIT, we do this for regions 2 and regions 4. We have C-Clear on the West Coast. KSU is going to be for you folks in region 5. Your first call, Yukon and Mid-Atlantic tab. If you're not sure who to reach out to, feel free to reach out to us at NJIT. We're very collegial with all the other tabs, so I'm happy to point you in the right direction there. And yeah, that's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Kaylin. If folks have questions, continue to feel free to drop them in the Q&A box and we will answer them time permitting. I'm just going through them now. Uh, Cecilia Gonzalez, I wanted to acknowledge a question that you asked. Could a community-based organization focus on reducing the number of vacant and problem properties, including brownfields, create a land bank at the community level? And if so, how could that work? What would the process look like? So I know my colleague Nora gave some context. So yes, land banks are typically created through state enabling legislation. So I would recommend doing a couple of things first. We have a National Land Bank Network map, and I believe the link to it is shared in our resource center. So I would first visit the map to see if there is a land bank that already exists for your community. And if not, I'd be happy to share with you a resource. We actually have a 10-step guide on how to create a land bank. Not all communities are qualified to create one. It depends on a number of factors, but it would be helpful for you to check out that guide just to kind of see what it all involves in starting a land bank. And I am happy to share that in the chat with the audience as well, in case there's interest for other folks on the call.
Thanks, Christina. I just wanted to answer another question from Cecilia that I see in the Q&A. So you had asked about ownership and taking title to the property. And again, I think my answer to almost every question is it depends on the local state enabling legislation and the establishing ordinance at the jurisdiction level. However, I did want to flag that definitely there are examples, including in the case studies publication, of land banks that have supported brownfield remediation without taking title to the property. I think, for example, the Genesee County Land Bank in Flint, Michigan, they have helped over years with the redevelopment of a former General Motors plant, which is now becoming the county's first state park. And they never took title to the property throughout that process, so they helped support a community visioning process that identified the park as the target end use, but the city was actually the owner at that time. Depending on who the owner is, how long they've owned the property, there are definitely going to be different liability considerations. And again, the asset of land banks being able to hold properties tax-free is when it can be really useful for them to take ownership in some instances, but definitely great examples of land banks doing this work without taking title as well.
Yeah, and I'd just like to point out that, again, with those EPA assessment grants, you don't need to own the property in order to do a lot of that due diligence and investigative work to kind of usher it along that process. And I see another question on eligibility. Is a city government eligible to apply if it has never applied for an EPA grant before? Yes. Absolutely, you're eligible just by being an entity of a local government. At least in the past, so the guidelines haven't come out yet. I can't really talk about specifically what they're looking for this cycle coming up. In the past, you have had to answer questions about your capacity and your ability to handle a federal grant, because they do, comes with some like strings attached. You have your tab providers to walk you through what some of those strings might look like, but yes, you are eligible.
And I did see that Julia has already responded, but I know we threw a lot of resources at you today, and there's a lot to download in the Resource Center, but this will also be shared via email, recording of the presentation, and the presentation slide decks themselves.
Hannah, I saw your comment as well. I just dropped the link to the map into the chat as well if folks prefer to access it there.
I see a question from Hannah in Chicago, talking about a site looking to redevelop a old contaminated U.S. steel lot that was also a campus for the Department of Defense. So the funding stream that I was talking about through the EPA, any sort of federal property is not going to be eligible for that program. They have their own funding streams. Especially maybe through like the Superfund funding. And then the second half of the question, has there been any use of land banks to counteract efforts that don't plan to effectively clean the land or serve the local community? I don't know from like a land bank perspective. I do know like on the state level, there might be funding and resources available for that. I know in New Jersey, we do.
And I just wanted to address as well, I think there was a question in the chat. It may have been answered in the chat, whether a property has an official designation as a brownfield. So the answer is no. And Kaylin, I don't know if you'd want to elaborate on this, but I did want to acknowledge, so there's brownfield sites and then there's Superfund sites. Superfund is an official federal designation, and there will be EPA resources allocated to address a Superfund site. A brownfield site is not an official designation. It's both tricky, but it gives you a lot of flexibility. So because it is the presence or potential or perceived presence of contamination, it's any site where you feel like you need to do some environmental assessment or due diligence before you're talking about breaking ground or putting a new business or residential development or whatever end use on the site is going to be considered a brownfield. And there are definitely laws at the state level as well that can affect that brownfield designation. For example, in Michigan, any property owned by a land bank is considered a brownfield. So that's something that's kind of unique. So there's some variation at the state and local level as well.
Yeah, I like that. One of the most common questions we get as a tab provider is like, well, where can I find the list of brownfields that's in my city or in my community? Like, who has that list? And the answer almost always is like, it doesn't exist. And because of the definition, it is a little flexible in a way. A lot of this does take diving into the history, understanding a lot about the site that just, most city or state governments don't have the capacity to do. But I think, again, that's part of the planning work that you can do, building that inventory, and then knowing which sites then might need a little more funding to address the potential contamination. And that's something definitely a land bank, I think, could be really strongly positioned to do. Maintain that brownfield inventory.
And I see as well this question here about whether a 501c3 is eligible for an EPA grant. Kayla, not sure if you want to speak to that.
Yes, they are.
Just want to acknowledge the NDIT team in the chat doing double duty, responding to a lot of the questions. So thank you for that, Mimi. Just want to call that out. Tom Doherty, I do see your message about the best way for land banks to position themselves for repurposing brownfields using private investments. I'm not quite sure of the answer to that question, but I did want to acknowledge it. And it's something that I am more than happy to look into and follow up with you following the webinar.
Yeah, sometimes that's, market dependent, where you have some private investors, some developers who aren't intimidated at all about brownfields, and they, just want that site. Again, that's market dependent. There's not, too much you can do to control that, but I think there are things that cities, land banks can do to make sites more marketable. And that's removing those question marks for developers. Doing some of that planning work, some of the upfront assessment work can really help give developers that confidence of, at least to a reasonable extent. I've seen enough to know that, like what Nora had brought up, sometimes you put that shovel in the ground and you hit a tank you didn't anticipate, but yeah, doing a lot of that upfront work and giving them confidence and working with them in the truly like a public-private partnership there's good opportunities for that in brownfield work.
Oh, I do want to answer this question I just saw come in. Workforce development opportunities. The EPA has a jobs training grant program as part of their suite of brownfields grants that is perfect for workforce development. So I would encourage you to check that out.
Also, Stephen, just acknowledging your question about the providing the tab agency for Ohio. I believe in our resource center, we do have a link that will help you find the tab provider for your region. So be sure to check that out. And again, we'll make sure we include that in the post-event email.
Yeah, it's Kansas State University. If you go on their website, they have a designated person for Region 5.
Well, seeing that we are coming up on time, I again want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Really appreciate being able to share about the case studies. Thank you, Nora. Thank you, Kaylin, for sharing your work as well. And I will turn it over to you, Julia.
Yeah, like Christina said, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to our wonderful speakers for sharing all this great information. I am sharing a post-event survey that we would really appreciate if you all could fill out. It'll help us improve our webinars in the future and get a sense of your experience today. As we said before, the video recording, the presentation slides, and all the resources that are in the resources tab will get sent out to all registrants within the next week. So be on the lookout for that. And we'll also include our speakers' contact info. I saw there were a lot of questions we couldn't get to, so feel free to reach out with the questions that you have. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.